Hey, Andrew here. In this video, you're going to learn a few new techniques for debugging Node.js. Now, if you're anything like me, the first time you debugged Node in some sort of GUI might have been with a tool like Node Inspector, which was pretty awesome and lets you debug your Node apps in the Chrome developer tools. Well, a lot has happened since then with other tooling, which is a good thing because Node Inspector is broken for a lot of use cases. In this video, you're going to learn how to use the new experimental feature built into Node that allows you to do that same thing, debug Node in the Chrome developer tools. We're also going to take a look at the Visual Studio Code Editor and its built-in debugger. It really is a fantastic tool. I've been using VSC quite a bit lately, and I must say it is definitely going to be my new editor going forward. So let's dive in and learn how to debug some Node.js applications. Before we get started, if you are watching this video on my website, mead.io, I'm using the Great Wistia player, which supports a table of contents. So there's a little menu item in the video player. You can crack that open to quickly navigate between all of the topics we're going to cover. So if you're coming back and you forget how to do something, just jump to the thing you forget. Otherwise, we are going to go through everything in order. So feel free to just watch this straight through. Now, before we can get started, we do need to make sure you have a few things on your computer. One, you are going to need Node installed. I am going to also assume that you know the very basics of JavaScript and Node, just some simple stuff. Nothing too complex like promises or anything like that. But you are going to need Node installed and you will need to know the basics. You will need to be using version 6.6 or higher. That means 6.10 would work great, and so would 7.8. If V8 is out by the time you're watching this, that works well too. Now, in the beginning of this video, we are not going to need any editor-specific features, so you can feel free to use anything you like, whether it's Sublime Text, Atom, or Visual Studio Code. In the second half, we are going to be using features specific to Visual Studio Code. It's my editor of choice as of late, and it has a great built-in debugger, which is what we're going to be using. So if you are interested in covering that as well, you can go ahead and download it. It's available for all operating systems. So take a quick second to make sure you have an editor, VSC, if you want to use its built-in debugger, and that you have Node installed. From here on out, I am going to assume you got that stuff set up. Now we're going to need a new folder where we're going to be writing some scripts. So let's go ahead and create a space for that code. I'm just going to make a folder on the desktop called Node Debugger. Feel free to call it whatever you want and feel free to toss it wherever you want. Once you have that folder in place, we're just going to crack it open inside of our text editor. Now I'm using VSC. You can use anything you like for this first part. Once the folder is open, all we're going to do is create the world's simplest JavaScript file. I'm going to call this one app.js. Go ahead and use the same name for the moment, and we're going to kick things off with a very basic program. I'm going to make a new variable using let, and we'll call this one name. I'm going to set it equal to my first name, and then we're going to console.log that value to the screen. Now I'm going to be using a few ES6 features here. I'm using let instead of var, same effect for this use case, and I am going to be using template strings to inject the name variable right inside, hello, followed by the name. I'm using the $, curly braces to inject the name variable. So when I run the program, I would expect hello Andrew to print to the screen. Let's go ahead and run this through Node. Now, if you are using VSC, you can open up an integrated terminal. Otherwise, you can use your computer's command prompt or terminal screen. Now, if you're using VSC, let's go ahead and go up to View Command Palette. I'm not going to talk about other keyboard shortcuts because they'll all be specific to your operating system, but the command palette is a universal way to pretty much do anything in VSC. So just memorize this one because we will be using the command palette here and there. Now, the only reason I'm doing this is to open up a new terminal. Let's go ahead and type in terminal. We're looking for create new integrated terminal. That's going to crack one open down at the bottom of the screen. And if I use pwd, I can see they've already navigated me to the project folder. From here, we'll use node app.js to run the script. Nothing too fancy there. Now, one of the ways we can debug our program is by using the debugger statement. Debugger, which looks just like this, tells the Node program to pause at this specific line. Now, it's not always going to pause. So if we save app.js and rerun the program, nothing happens. We see hello Andrew and we're returned back to the command prompt. We have to use special arguments to get it to stop. Now, I'm not going to be covering the command line debugger, which is accessible by running node debug followed by your file. This is going to pause and it's going to let you do some debugging, but I don't prefer this. It's a little difficult to use, doesn't give you enough context, and it's just not my style. So we're going to be using GUI debuggers. We are not going to be using this one. I'm going to shut this down and we can go ahead and run our first Node application through the Chrome Developer Tools. To do this, we're going to be using Node --inspect. The inspect argument tells Node that you want to inspect your application's process through the Chrome Developer Tools. So if we go ahead and do just this, what do we get? Well, we get that a debugger is listening on 9229. We also see a warning. It's an experimental feature. That's fine. And we see a URL. This URL is something that we can visit in the Chrome browser to open up the developer tools and debug our app. But we also see that hello Andrew printed and our program stopped. So obviously something is going wrong. What we need to do, in addition to adding inspect, which lets us open things up in the Chrome browser, is also add --debug -brk. This is going to start up Node in debug mode, and it is going to break before the program ever runs. So it's going to pause before it runs that first line, letting you open up the URL and get over there so you don't miss anything important. Let's go ahead and run this command with those two arguments. This time, we're going to see hello Andrew does not print to the terminal. We do have our URL though, so let's go ahead and copy that to the clipboard. I'm going to go over to Chrome and I'm going to paste it in to a new tab. When I do, we get the Chrome Developer Tools in full screen. And we also see that we are stopped right here where let name Andrew shows up. Now we have our 3-line program sitting right here, and we also have some stuff that Node wraps our file in. Let's go ahead and click play to get started. So at this point, our program hasn't run. When we go through the script, we stop right at our breakpoint. That's on line 3. Now at this point in time, we can do a ton of cool stuff. On the right-hand side, you can see the call stack, which you can click through to view where all of this stuff is happening. The top one is your code. And down below, we also get our local scope. So right here, you see I have a name variable equal to Andrew accessible in my scope. Down below in the console, which you can toggle using the escape key, we can actually run whatever we want. I can print out the value of name. I can manipulate name, setting name equal to name plus my last name. That's space Mead. Now name equals Andrew Mead. So we can use the debugger's console to manipulate the state that the program is paused in. Now, if I go ahead and click play, what's going to happen? Hello Andrew Mead shows up to the screen. This means that the changes we made in the console, they were actually persisted. And when the program ran the console.log, we're able to see the updated information. So this is just a quick rundown on how you can use the Chrome Developer Tools to debug your Node applications. Now let's switch back to Atom real quick. Excuse me, Visual Studio Code. I've been using Atom for so long, it just comes up naturally. I'm going to remove that debugger statement. I'm going to save app.js. Then I'm going to shut down the debugger and restart it. This is going to spit out a URL. Once again, we're going to copy this URL and we're going to head over into the browser. We can go ahead and paste this in the browser tab. You can see the old session was closed. That is expected. And here we are. We are paused at the very first line. Now I have no debugger statements in here. So if I click play, it's going to run through the whole program and it's going to stop. What I want to show you instead is that you can actually add line breaks right here inside of their editor. You've got a file viewer on the left-hand side, which shows you your application's files. And I can just click the line number to add this little blue guy. And that says, hey, when you get to that line, just go ahead and stop. Now that I have my line break in place, I'm going to click play. And you can see that I automatically stop right here, which is fantastic. Now you'll notice that when you stop on a line, it stops before that line is executed. It has not printed hello Andrew to the screen. It's going to do that as soon as we continue on. Now we can go ahead and continue on. And there we go. Hello Andrew prints to the screen. The program is done. And that is it for our little editor line break example. And now this is great and all, but it is a very trivial example. So let's go ahead and debug something a little more complex. We are going to create a very simple Express server, and we're going to use the debugger to take a look at the incoming HTTP requests. Now, if you've never used Express before, that's fine. We are just going to go through a few very simple things to get a server up and running. First up, we are going to need to shut down our current debugger. I'm going to clear that terminal output, and I am going to use npm init to generate a package.json file so we can install Express. You can just jam that enter key a few times until you get to the end. We're going to use default values for everything, then just confirm with yes, and all that command does is it creates a new file right here. We're not going to be manually changing this file. What we are going to do though is install Express using npm install Express. You can just grab the latest version. We'll be using a very minimal feature set here, and we are going to use the save flag to save it as an application dependency. Now, once you have Express installed, you can go ahead and follow along, creating a very simple server. We're going to write maybe 12 lines of code, starting by importing Express onto an Express constant. We're going to require Express right here. Then we're going to make a new Express application. We'll call it app. And to make a new Express app, we just call Express as a function. Next up, we want to define the routes for our server. In our case, we're going to have one get route. So we're going to use app.get, and it's going to be the root of our web server, which is just / in the first argument. We could have something like /test for that route, but we're going to stick to the basics. Now, the next argument and the final one in get is going to be our callback function. This runs when someone actually hits that route. We get the request, we get our response object, and we potentially get other arguments, but we won't be using them. Things like next are not going to be required here. The last thing we have to do is to actually start up the server using app.listen. I'm going to go ahead and listen on port 3000, pick whatever port works for you, and I am going to use an arrow function to print out a quick message. Using console.log, server is up. Excellent. Now that we have this very basic setup in place, we just need to send something back. Response.send is going to let us send back some text, and I'm going to send back, hey, it worked. All right, there we go. I actually lied. It's not 12 lines, it is 8 lines. Before we do any debugging, let's just make sure the server works. Down below, I'm going to start it up using node app.js, and you should get that little message. Server is up. If you are getting that, we can confirm it's actually working by opening up the browser and just navigating to localhost 3000. Right here, you should see, hey, it worked, printing to the screen. Now we want to go ahead and actually do some debugging. So we can switch back over to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to toss a debugger right here inside of the route callback just before we respond with response.send. Let's toss in a debugger statement, save the file, and we're going to run app in debug mode again. That's going to be node. Right here, we'll use debug brk. Then we'll use inspect. Finally, we want to run app.js. When we go ahead and do this, we're going to get our URL. This is great. Let's take it, copy it, and open it up in a new tab. We want to keep localhost 3000 open as well. Now at this point, remember, we paused on that first line, and we know when we pause, the line doesn't actually run. This means that if you refresh localhost 3000, the server is not actually live. We have to go ahead and crank it up by hitting play. Now this is going to pause at your old debugger from the previous file. You can go ahead and remove that, click play again, and now you should see server is up, printing in the console down below. And if you go to localhost 3000, you should be able to refresh the page. Now when you do, you should be automatically brought back to the Chrome developer tools because it's saying, hey, we hit a debugger, we are pausing. At this point, In the other tab, you can see we're hanging. It's still waiting for the request. It's being pretty generous with how long it waits. From our point of view as a debugger, though, we can take a look at what came in. For example, we can rip open that request object. We can see a ton of useful information like the HTTP method, the original URL, any query parameters that might have been provided. Anything we want to check out on the request is available right here. And that can be really useful when you're debugging your applications and you can't figure out why something is not coming in or going out correctly. Now, if we do go ahead and continue on, we're going to see in the other tab, the request finally completes. And instead of loading, it says, hey, it worked. So using the Chrome Developer Tools and the debugger keyword, we can debug all sorts of applications. Now we can also go ahead and edit live right here. So I can remove the debugger, save the file, refresh localhost 3000, and this time around, you can see it prints right away. The debugger was removed. I can always add it back in by typing debugger, or I can simply just click the line number. I want to debug line 5. Now, if I go back to localhost 3000 and refresh it, it is going to open up the debugger. So you have a lot of freedom when you're debugging. You don't have to go into your editor to tweak stuff. If you're just trying to mess around with some variables or values, you can do almost everything you need to do right here inside of the editor. So that's a slightly more complex example of how you can use the built-in debugger to debug your Node applications. Now I want to take a look at how you can use the Visual Studio Code debugger to do the same thing. It's not going to let us do something completely different. We're going to be doing the exact same things. We're going to be stopping the program. We're going to be looking at variable values, but we'll be using the built-in feature, which means you don't have to open up a Chrome tab. You can do all of it right here from the editor, which is a really fantastic thing. Now, you don't need any fancy plugins or settings to do what we're about to do, but if you are interested in what I have installed and how I have my editor configured, I'm going to show you a couple quick screens. Here I have all of the plugins I use. You can take a moment to pause the video and install them if you like. There's also a couple down below. The Sublime Text Key Map plugin, which is fantastic. The other thing I'm going to show you really quickly before we go any further is my editor settings. I open up the command palette, type in settings, and we're looking for those user settings. On the right-hand side, I have just a few small configurations. These are some things that I personally like. They're not for everybody, but you can also go ahead and copy those if you want to configure your settings just like mine. All right, that is it for settings. What we're going to do is head into this little debugger menu. Now, when you first do this, you're going to get almost nothing. There is no default configuration. So we're going to have to teach Visual Studio Code how to debug a Node app. It needs to know how to start an application, and in some cases, it needs a little more information, but we'll start with a very basic example. I'm going to go ahead and shut down the current application instance because we need to free up port 3000. Over inside of the debug menu, we can go ahead and add a configuration since we currently have none. And when you click this, one of two things is going to happen. The first thing is you might have a pre-populated file, so you might not see what I see here. You might have some comments and a little boilerplate. You might also have an empty file depending on your VSC version and operating system. If you do, you should get this little template, click enter, and it should generate a very basic JSON file. Now, your file doesn't need to look exactly like mine. All we do need to do, though, is go into the configurations array, make sure to go to a new line, and we're going to click Add Configuration. This is going to bring up a list of various Node.js configurations that we can go ahead and integrate into our application. There's a ton for various things like Gulp, Electron, Mocha, all sorts of cool stuff. We're going to start with the very basic one. This one is called Launch Program. Now, when you click that, it is going to automatically add a little object right here in the configurations array. We're debugging Node. We are trying to launch a program, and here we have a name, Launch Program, which is going to show up in the menu a little bit later. Next up, we tell it exactly where that program is. Right here, you can see it's looking inside of our workspace root. This is a Visual Studio Code variable that you can use, and it is looking for an app.js file, which happens to be the name of the file that we have in our application. And this is all we need in launch.json for now, so let's save this file, and over inside of the menu, you should see launch program showing up. This text is coming right here. It's coming from the name property on our configuration object. Now this is going to run app.js and it's going to run it in debug mode, and we can do that by clicking the play button. There's also keyboard shortcuts for that sort of thing. I'm going to go ahead and click play, and this is going to start up the application. Now what exactly is happening? Well, if we switch over to the debug console, we can see the output. Right here we see we started the debugger, and we can also see that the server is up message printed to the screen. That means we should be able to make some requests over inside of the browser and actually get things paused. I'm going to switch over to Chrome. I'm going to refresh localhost 3000. And you can see that I automatically get brought back into the editor. Here we are paused right before we respond, which means inside of Chrome, we're hanging. We're waiting for the response. Currently, there is none. Back inside of VSC, we can do anything we could have done in the Chrome Developer Tools. Down below in the debug console, I can take a look at some variables like request or response, and we can expand them just like we could do in Chrome. We could also dive into something like request.method to get some specific information off of one of those values. Here we have our get method printing, which is correct. We also have access to the call stack and our variables. Right here we have our local scope with request, response, and this. You can also dump right into those variables. You can also dive right into those variables right here, which makes debugging even easier. You don't even need to use the debug console to look at variable values. Now we have this little panel right here for our debugger. We can click play. This is going to continue through the program, and over inside of the browser, we should see that the request was finished, and hey, it worked, printed to the screen. Now inside of VSC, you have a lot of great things you can do. You can quickly restart the program if you want. For example, I can change server is up to server is running. I can save the file, click that little refresh button, and this is automatically going to restart the application in debug mode. Another great feature if you find yourself making small tweaks as you work your way out of a bug. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a few other things that we can do inside of VSC. To do this over inside of the browser, I am going to refresh the page to get us back to that breakpoint. Inside of VSC, we can add our own debuggers. Right here, I can click just to the left of the line number, and this is going to add a new breakpoint. If I go ahead and click play, you can see we actually paused right here because we added our custom breakpoint. We're able to do this just like we could inside of Chrome. You can add as many breakpoints as you want in order to change how you're going to debug your program while it's running. Super handy tool. We also have the ability to dive into our various function calls with these three options right here. The first one is called step over. This is going to step over a function call, which is most likely what you want. You can also use step into, for example, we can step into response.send and see how that works. We can go line by line through the program, though usually this is not something I find myself doing. We can then use step out to come back to our code, and we can wrap things up with a play to finish off the debugger. Now back inside of Chrome, just to confirm, we haven't changed the behavior of the program at all. We just did some debugging, which did cause the request to pause. Using this built-in debugger, we can do a lot of awesome stuff right from the editor. It's been growing on me lately, and I must be honest, I do find myself using this more than the Chrome Developer Tools integration, even though this is specific to the editor. Now, what if your file name is not app.js? If I rename app.js to something like myfile.js and I try to rerun the debugger, what exactly is going to happen? Well, when I run it, we're going to get an error. It's going to say, hey, the program doesn't exist, and it shows you the path it's looking for. It's still looking for app.js. That's because that is the file name defined here. Now, unfortunately, there is no dynamic way to set this up, which means you have to change the launch config file for each program. Just kidding, there is. You can do anything you want with VSC. Let's go ahead and take a peek. I'm going to open up the docs. We can go ahead and Google visual studio code debugging, and I'm only doing this to make you aware of where you can find even more options, and we're looking for this one. That's the docs editor debugging path. When we crack this open, there's a ton of information here and it can get real overwhelming. We're looking for a couple specific things. First up, on the right-hand side, variable substitution. Now we've already used one of these. We have workspace root inside of our program, but there's another one called file, which lets us debug the currently opened file. This is a dynamic file name, and that is exactly what we want. Now, in order to do this, we are going to also change one more thing. Let's jump up to launch configurations. Right here, as an example, we can see we have program, which we have now, but we also have CWD for current working directory. We're going to go ahead and use these exact two lines. This is going to start from our project folder, but it's going to open up whatever file we happen to have open. And that's exactly what we want to do. To set this up, we're going to go back into Visual Studio Code. We're going to change program over to their VSC variable called file, and we're going to add on something new, CWD, and we're going to set that equal to what we had previously. That's workspace, what was it called? Workspace, uppercase R, root. With this in place, we're going to be able to do exactly what we did before, but with a file that has a dynamic name. I can now click play again to run our launch program debugger. It starts up the server and everything works as expected. This is the most standard launch configuration I find myself using on a regular basis. You could also change this to launch Node.js program, and that's simply going to change the text up here, making it a little more obvious what that specific configuration is intended to do. Now, there's just one more configuration that we're going to be adding to our launch.json file in this video. I'm going to toss my cursor down here, click add configuration, and this is the first one, Node.js attach to process. Attach to process is fantastic. This is going to allow you to attach the VSC debugger to an existing Node application that's running under debug mode. Now, why would you ever want to do this? Well, think about something like Nodemon. Nodemon automatically restarts your program every single time you change a file. This is a very common tool used for local Node development. With this, we can reattach the debugger every time we make a change to the program and Nodemon restarts, and that's exactly what we're going to be setting up right here. Let's go ahead and save launch.json, and before we use Nodemon inside of the terminal, all we're going to do is run our program. We're going to use node, we're going to use debug brk, but we're going to leave off inspect, instead just typing myfile.js. Now, when I do this, it starts up your program, but it's not actually doing anything just yet. And you'll notice we're also not getting a Chrome developer tool URL printing. That's because it's waiting for something to attach to 5858, which is exactly what we just set up. So we can switch over to attach to process, run that. We can pick the process right here. This is the exact one we want, and we're going to be able to debug that process. You can see we're paused on the very first line. We can click play to go through the motions. Server is running prints in the terminal, and everything is working as expected. So being able to attach to an existing process is actually really powerful. Now, I've personally never, ever done this. This is just an example. The more common use case is to attach to a Nodemon process. Now, in launch.json, we can actually remove this line completely, the process ID one. We do not need to pick a process. We can just automatically bind to port 5858. That's going to have the exact same effect. So if I disconnect and restart the server, I'm going to save launch.json and rerun attach to process. This time it doesn't ask us to pick the process ID. We just get brought right into the debugger, which is most likely what you want. All debugging environments use that 5858 port. This is some standard stuff. So now let's continue on to Nodemon. We're going to need to install it. It's a command line tool. We can use npm install with the G flag to install it globally. We're installing it globally because we do want to run it from the command line. Once you go ahead and run that command, we'll be able to actually run Nodemon. We'll check it out, and then we'll look at how we can debug our Nodemon applications. Right here, it should be done, and just go ahead and make sure that it was installed correctly by running Nodemon -- version. You should see a valid version number. If you're getting an error, you might need to restart your terminal in order to actually use Nodemon. Now at this point, we just want to run our program through Nodemon. That's Nodemon space myfile.js. Nothing fancy here. This is going to use the most bare bones set of Nodemon features. That is going to start up our program and watch that directory for changes. So here server is running prints with a period. If I change it over to a couple exclamation marks and I save the file, it detected the file change, and here we see our exclamation marks. Now the same thing can happen if we are debugging this process. So let's go ahead and shut things down inside of the terminal. I'm going to clear the output. We are going to use Nodemon, and we're going to use that exact same debug, if I can ever spell it correctly, brk argument. We're running myfile.js. And when we do this, we're going to see that Nodemon is still watching the folder for changes. So if we change something, it actually is going to restart the process. And we're also waiting for a debugger to bind to 5858. All we have to do is run attach to process, and here we are. We are now debugging our application that's actually running through Nodemon. I'm going to click the play button once, and here we see server is running prints. The program is now started. If I go into the browser and I refresh localhost 3000, we're going to automatically switch back over to VSC. We're brought to our debugger area. Now this is cool and all, but what if I change the program, switching up this message completely? Maybe I go ahead and create a port variable, and I'll set that port equal to 3000. And then I use port here, and I switch this over to a template string that also uses port. Notice I'm using backticks. Server is up, on, and then we'll inject the port. That's perfectly fine. And if we save the file, you're going to see the program automatically restarted. All we need to do is rerun attach to process, and we're right back in. Now we don't have to actually rerun attach to process every single time. There's a really sweet setting we can configure right here to get that done for us. We're going to add a restart to this configuration object. Now you can see what it does right here. Restart session after Node.js has terminated. We're going to go ahead and set that equal to true. This is going to restart the debugger after it's terminated, and it's going to get terminated when Nodemon restarts. So if we go ahead and save launch.json, we can test this out. I'm going to go ahead and shut every single thing down. Use clear to clear the terminal output, and we're going to rerun that previous command. That's Nodemon debug break myfile.js. Here we have our debugger listening. We can go ahead and attach to that process, and like we had before, we are seeing everything we would expect. Now we can go ahead and click play. That's going to print our message. Server is up on 3000. Let's see what happens when we make a change though. I'm going to toss some exclamation marks onto the end of our custom message. We're brought right back into the debugger, and we're brought back into the debugger with the changed file. So if I click the play button, here we're seeing server is up on 3000 printing to the screen. Now, I know we covered a ton of stuff in this video. I'm going to guess we're probably running around 37 minutes by this point, but this is all really, really practical, useful information. And it's one of those set it and forget it sort of things. You're never going to open up launch.json again. I find that I opened it up once when I first set it up, and I haven't touched it since. Now, I'll be honest, I usually use the Nodemon technique. The Chrome developer tools are great. I just personally think the built-in ones are a little nicer. If you think so too, then go ahead and switch over to VSC. It really is such a fantastic editor with a great set of built-in features and an awesome community of plugins and extensions. Now, there is a comments section on the blog post on mead.io, so if you ran into any problems, you have any questions about debugging, or you have a tip of your own, that is the place to post it. All right, that is it for this one. Hopefully you picked up some new techniques and tools you can use going forward to make your Node development just a little bit more pleasant. You can overcome those bugs a little bit quicker. That is it. Take a quick moment to subscribe. If you liked what you saw here, you can do that down below, and you'll get a few very infrequent emails with content just like this. I'll see you next time.